Shaka Zulu was his given name at birth in the heartland of the Zulu Kingdom, which primarily comprised Natal Province in the northeast of present-day South Africa, where he was born indeterminately in the summer of 1787. Shaka was born into the Zulu clan in modern-day Natal, where his father, Senzingakona, was the chieftain. A few years prior to Shaka's birth in 1781, Shaka's father had assumed the clan's rule. In accordance with Zulu custom, as clan chief, Senzingakona had multiple wives and sired a large number of male offspring. Thus, Shaka had a large number of half-brothers, several of whom would later assume significant roles in his life. Shaka was born into Nandi, the progeny of Beba, a chief of the Langeni people, an adjacent Zulu's clan. However, Nandi was not among Senzinggakona's wives at the moment of Shaka's conception and birth. This rendered Shaka illegitimate in the clan's estimation. Consequently, Nandi and Shaka were expelled during Shaka's childhood. Following a period of nomadic existence, Nandi and her son eventually established themselves among the Mthethwa people in the late 18th century. It was during this time that Shaka, who had previously excelled as a fighter in his youth, quickly became a member of the Mthethwa warrior elite. It was customary for males in the area to engage in military affairs when they reached adolescence. However, Shaka's prodigious abilities notwithstanding, there were concerning indications regarding the degree of violence he exhibited during his youth. At one point, King Dingiswayo, the Mthethwa ruler and a mentor to the future king of the Zulus, dispatched Shaka and a number of others to assault the adjacent Amambata page. The Mthethwa and Zulu, historically and presently, constitute a subgroup of the Bantu people, which span a significant portion of sub-Saharan Africa, from the Cape of Good Hope in the east to the Congo and all the way south. Prior to delving deeper into Shaka's career and the formation of the Zulu Kingdom, it is imperative to comprehend the structures and operations that governed Zulu society and the broader Bantu culture during the early 19th century. An instance of this can be seen in the Zulu, who, like the other Bantu peoples of Africa, were predominantly cattle-dependent and utilized the Bantu languages to unite their societies and economies. Situated in the northeastern region of present-day South Africa, their territory extended from the Tugela River in the south to the Pongola River in the north. During the 18th century, the Zulus existed as several small clans, each of which ruled over a slender portion of land. This land was just sufficient to provide adequate pasturage for their livestock and sustain their people and livestock with sufficient meat and milk. However, by the latter half of the 18th century, both the Zulu population and the herds of livestock under their dominion had grown substantially. The Zulu culture upheld numerous customs that had been observed throughout sub-Saharan Africa for millennia. The small Zulu clans were ruled by an Inkosi, a king or paramount chief, whose household comprised his wives and frequently many children. At a lower social stratum, communities were subdivided into kraals or isabaya, which were economic units or homesteads inhabited by individual families. These kraals were centered on the cattle that the clan chiefs owned. Undoubtedly, the focal point of society revolved around cattle, with sheep and goats, which were subordinate to a particular clan, playing a secondary role. This was primarily due to the fact that milk curds constituted the cornerstone of the Zulu diet. Consequently, cattle served as the principal indicator of wealth and the medium of exchange in Zululand. Moreover, the Zulu culture observed polygamy, wherein men acquired their wives in exchange for cows. Religious fervor dominated their society, with an emphasis on ancestral spirits and magic. The Zulu believed that these entities materialized in the physical world, especially during fire rituals and other ceremonies led by witch doctors, who served as the priest's equivalent in Bantu societies. The technology of this society was primitive. Most tools were formed out of wood and other malleable substances to make spoons, bowls and other household goods. What iron ore could be easily found on the surface of the region was smelted, using basic forges and generally fashioned into spear tips and other weapons. This focus on manufacturing weapons is hardly incongruous, as all adult males in Zulu society were warriors, They fought in huge massed formations of fighters called impis. They wore no real apparel or armor to protect themselves, other than wooden shields covered with cowhide, while the primary weapon was a 6-foot-long spear called an assegai. Also, battle tactics were virtually non-existent, individual clans relying on sheer numerical strength to overpower their rivals. Thus, Shaka was born into a kingdom which was built around the idea of controlling cattle and manpower in order to rise to the top. His ascent would be based on his ability to do this effectively and also on some innovations which he introduced to Zulu warfare and society. Shaka's ascent to authority commenced in 1816, shortly before his 20th birthday, following the death of his father Senzingakona. The Zulu chieftain had appointed Sigajana, one of his numerous sons, to succeed him. However, Shaka, the outcast son, was resolute in his intention to disrupt this line of succession. In 1816, he asserted his sovereignty over the Zulu with the assistance of Dingiswayo and his adoptive clan of the Mtathwa. Through this endeavor, Shaka exhibited a ruthlessness that would ultimately define him. In order to accomplish this, he enlisted the aid of Ingwadi, an additional half-brother of his and Sigajana's, to assassinate Sigajana. Subsequently, Shaka led a formidable military escort supplied by Dingiswayo consisting of Mtathwa troops. These troops promptly executed any individuals openly affiliated with the previous regime. Shaka ascended to the throne of the Zulu people, where he ruled as a member of a formidable confederation of Bantu tribes in the southern region. This alliance could have potentially served as a moderating force on Shaka's future behavior. It is worth noting that Dingiswayo had previously reprimanded Shaka for his disproportionate use of force when prosecuting the Ama Mbata people in close proximity to the Mtathwa. However, should this have been the case, this restraining presence was swiftly eroded, as the Mtathwa engaged in conflict with the Ndwandwe people along the northern border in 1817, mere months after Shaka assumed leadership of the Zulus. The Ndwandwe Zulu War, which spanned from 1817 to 1819, was a pivotal juncture in the Zulu Kingdom's rise to power and the consolidation of Shaka's dominance in the area. After minor skirmishes in 1817, the two factions, the Zulus and the Mtathwa, under the leadership of Shaka, and the Ndwandwe and the northern allies, led by Zwide, appeared in April 1818 for a major pitched battle, known as the Bat. In order to impede the Ndwandwe advance into Zululand, Shaka had already deployed guerrilla units in strategic locations to harass Zwide's advancing troops. To prevent the Ndwandwe from acquiring additional resources as they marched south, the countryside was ravaged and devoid of livestock and other agricultural products. Shaka then concentrated the majority of his army around the Jikyokli Hill, hoping to exploit the elevation and exploit a strategic advantage to compensate for his numerical disadvantage. Thus, when Nomalanjana, the commander of Zwide, and his troops arrived at Jikyokli Hill, the Ndwandwe's numerical advantage proved to be detrimental, as Nomalanjana's forces became conspicuously consolidated, rendering them susceptible to projectiles launched by Shaka's Zulus down the incline. As the conflict continued, the Ndwandwe's scarcity of provisions, specifically potable water, emerged as a significant challenge. Hours into the conflict, Shaka, weary and frustrated by the situation, ordered a reserve column of his most elite warriors hiding nearby to advance on Jikyokli Hill and attack one of the exposed rear columns of the Ndwandwe. The Ndwandwe's lines were subsequently breached and relentlessly pursued by the Zulus in the hours that followed. At the conclusion of the battle, it was rumored, albeit possibly exaggeratedly, that as many as the Ndwandwe Zulu War was significantly influenced by the Battle of Jikyokli Hill. Following Shaka's succeeding military triumph at the Battle of the Vletus River in 1819, the Zulu king and his impis proceeded to invade the northern regions of Ndwandwe. Upon their arrival at King Zwide's headquarters in the vicinity of Nongoma, the war's outcome had become abundantly apparent. Zwide, along with a number of other senior Ndwandwe rulers, had fled northwards. Shaka instituted Zulu suzerainty over the Ndwandwe, whereas rulers like Zwide were content with establishing new principalities in modern-day Mozambique and Tanzania to the north. As a consequence of the Ndwandwe-Zulu War of 1817 to 1819, Shaka successfully established the expansive kingdom of the Zulus, which spanned from Natal in the far north to the vicinity of the present-day border between Mozambique and South Africa. How had Shaka amassed such an astounding succession of military triumphs within a relatively brief time span against an adversary that possessed an overwhelming numerical advantage? The solution can be found within the military revolution that he instigated within Zulu society, which rapidly proliferated across Bantu society in the sub-Saharan African region. Shaka's military conquests were propelled by a sequence of military reforms that were initiated by the Zulu king in the late 1810s and early 1820s. As we have seen, for decades, the Zulu people predominantly employed the assegai, a 6-foot-long spear resembling a javelin with an iron or steel tip. While it could be utilized for close-quarters combat, its primary function was long-range throwing. To enhance his soldiers' tactical advantage in close-range combat, Shaka initiated the provision of a shorter, sword-like instrument known as the ikalwa. This weapon was widely employed during the Battle of Jekuakli Hill. Shaka allegedly also implemented the bullhorn formation as a tactical approach for the Zulus in battle. Perhaps he had acquired this knowledge from Dingiswayo and the Mtathwa before assuming the throne of the Zulus. By utilizing this formation, Zulu warriors or impis arranged themselves in the shape of a bull's horns, with two sizable wings of troops flanking the ranked formation. This configuration facilitated forward movement in the battlefield, with the central portion of the formation designated as the chest meeting. Shaka implemented additional military reforms within the Zulu army, such as the establishment of distinct warrior ranks based on combat prowess and age. Consequently, the most seasoned and formidable Zulu warriors were stationed at the core of the bullhorn formation, while the more youthful and swift soldiers were assigned to the horns situated to the left and right of the battlefield. Furthermore, he oversaw a system that mandated Zulu males to commence combat at a later time. However, certain elements of the Shakan military revolution are considered mythical. For example, while there are assertions that Shaka compelled his warriors to fight and live predominantly barefoot to fortify their feet, there is no empirical evidence to support this claim. Furthermore, it is highly improbable, as suggested by numerous historians, that he instructed his troops to march up to 80 kilometers in a single day. However, they might have been able to cover no more than 20 kilometers, which is a respectable distance. In order to facilitate the provision of supplies to the army, Shaka recognized that his military reforms also required a transformation of Zulu society. To this end, he reformed Zulu society from its more traditional hierarchical structure, which emphasized blood and clan affiliations for advancements, to one in which senior positions in the military and administration were awarded on the basis of merit rather than blood descent. Furthermore, he overcame the formidable caste of witch doctors and seized authority over the Zulu church. Furthermore, he attempted to reform the social hierarchy that was imposed on children, enlisting Zulu children as carriers of military supplies for the armies. This endeavor enhanced the army's mobility and established a more centralized and regimented state under the leadership of Shaka and his close adherents. Ultimately, this enabled him to unite the territories previously under the control of the Zulus, Mtathwa, and end up until this point, Shaka's rise had predominantly transpired among African tribes, predominantly of the Bantu people residing in sub-Saharan Africa. However, after establishing the Zulu position firmly in the late 1810s, Shaka and the Zulus would progressively be confronted with the arrival of Europeans in southern Africa during the 1820s. These Europeans were situated in the vicinity of the Cape of Good Hope in the southwest and progressively extended to the northeast and north. The Portuguese first made contact with the region in the late 15th century, when they reached southern Africa as part of ongoing naval expeditions to circumnavigate Africa and discover a sea route to Asia from Europe. In accordance with their 16th-century strategy of establishing trading and supply stations along the coast of Africa, the Portuguese eventually established small settlements in this region. Similar to a significant portion of their colonies in Asia and the Americas, these colonies were besieged by the Dutch Republic in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. As a consequence, the Dutch East India Company established the first major European settlement in Africa. By the late 18th century, the Cape Colony had surpassed 50,000 inhabitants, commonly referred to as Boers due to the Afrikaans and Dutch words for farmer. However, due to events in Europe, authority over the area was about to undergo a radical transformation. Amidst the French Revolutionary Wars, Britain and the Dutch Republic found themselves on opposing sides in the 1790s. As a consequence, the British invaded the Cape Colony in 1795, and following a decisive triumph at the Battle of Muizenberg in early autumn, the Cape Colony was subsequently occupied by the British. Subsequently, the Cape Colony came under British occupation as the Napoleonic Wars neared their conclusion almost 2 decades later. At that juncture, the Anglo-Dutch Treaty of 1814 was signed between the Dutch and the Netherlands. Under the terms of this treaty, the Dutch ca. Following the British capitulation of the Cape Colony, a considerable number of the Boers, who were predominantly Dutch settlers, began migrating north and northeast to establish new independent colonies outside the Cape Colony's jurisdiction. This brought succeeding generations of Boers closer to the Zulu Kingdom throughout the 19th century, which had significant ramifications for Shaka's rule and, more specifically, for that of his successors. Early indications of European encroachment into Shaka and Zulu-dominated regions emerged in 1822. During that year, several merchants from the Cape Colony, including Francis Farewell, a former lieutenant of the British Royal Navy, made the decision to engage in trade with the Zulus and other indigenous populations of the Natal region. This endeavour took place at the prospective location of the city of Durban, situated along the Natal coastline. In 1824, this was formally established as a trading station, establishing the initial tangible channels of communication and trade between the expanding European colony in southern Africa and the Zulus. As a consequence, Europeans arrived in the Natal region, which contributes significantly to the understanding of Shaka's reign and the Zulu narrative. A substantial portion of our understanding regarding Shaka and the emergence of the Zulu Kingdom in southern Africa during this period is sourced from the writings of Europeans who lived in the region at the time and were acquainted with him. Among these was Nathaniel Isaacs, an English merchant and adventurer who arrived in the Cape Colony in 1825 and promptly continued to the northeast with the intention of conducting ivory trade with the Zulus in Natal. Isaacs's expedition was primarily concerned with this region. Following this, Isaacs and Finn lived among the Zulus for several years, and a substantial portion of our knowledge regarding Shaka and his reign is derived from a 2-volume study titled Travels and Adventures in Eastern Africa, published by Isaacs in 1836. This was the first European account of King Shaka and the Zulu Empire. However, notwithstanding these initial encounters between Europeans and the Zulu nation in the Natal region starting in the early 1820s, Shaka's primary source of contention was with his compatriots the Bantu people. Throughout this period, he engaged in ongoing warfare with neighboring tribes and attempted to incorporate them into the Zulu state. This included employing military strategies that were already developed during his reign. Nevertheless, war remained central to Shaka's reign. The Zulu Kingdom which Shaka created was achieved with an enormous human cost. Accurate estimates of the number of people killed during the wars he orchestrated, between 1816 and 1828, are notoriously difficult to obtain, owing to the lack of death records, censuses, army lists and other records which would allow us to calculate the mortality rate in Southeast Africa during his reign. But we can make some effort to assess the general level of death associated with Shaka's rule. For instance, we know that the war with the Ndwandwe between 1817 and 1819 almost certainly resulted in over 25,000 deaths. Equally, scholars of sub-Saharan Africa during the 19th century call this period the imfi, meaning the crushing or scattering, a name applied to the decades from the late 18th century through to the mid-19th century. owing to the high levels of disruption and death which occurred throughout the region of modern-day South Africa, Mozambique, Zimbabwe and Rwanda during this half-century. Academics are in agreement that the total number of fatalities linked to the impi ranges from 1 to 2 million. Shaka's wars played a pivotal role in this. Therefore, it is reasonable to conclude that his involvement in the Zulus' conflicts, in addition to the establishment of the Zulu Kingdom, likely claimed the lives of significantly more than 100,000 individuals. Undoubtedly, Shaka's penchant for violence was substantial. During his conquests, villages were subjected to raids, and numerous kraals and other structures were incinerated. Frequently, if our sources are accurate, children, elderly men, and women in the conquered region were indiscriminately executed, and those who managed to survive were coerced into enlisting in the Zulu military at an appropriate age. This course of action is not unexpected. All of this merely contributed to the escalation of instability in the surrounding area, as a number of Shaka's most prominent generals decided to forge their own principalities and abandon their masters. For example, in the mid-1820s, Mzilikazi opted to vacate the customary territories of the Zulus, transporting substantial quantities of livestock and troops to establish his own indelible kingdom. Similarly, another Shaka commander named Zawangandaba migrated northward into the region around the same time. Shaka had established a substantial Zulu kingdom as a consequence of the military reforms he instigated, which prompted a commensurate restructuring of Bantu society in Southeast Africa, and the ceaseless conflicts of the late 1810s and 1820s. As of 1825, he had achieved dominion over a region spanning approximately 11,500 square miles, 30,000 kilometers, extending from the Pongolo River in the south to central Natal and from the coast to the Drakensberg mountain range inland. During this time, he oversaw an estimated 250,000 Zulus and hundreds of thousands of other dependent peoples. They all participated in an ever more intricate administrative system, which required tributes in the form of agricultural products, livestock, ivory, textiles, and other valuables. As the 1820s proceeded, some aspects of Shaka's reign as it went on escape exact description. Despite the accounts which have come down to us from Isaacs, Finn and others, perhaps one of the most difficult to understand aspects concerns Shaka's family life. As we have seen, Zulu society was polygamous and a warrior king such as Shaka would have been expected to have many wives, as well as dozens of concubines, and a very large number of offspring. The goal here was to produce many sons, from amongst which the best warrior and ruler would emerge on merit, rather than simply by dint of being the eldest, such as was the practice amongst Europe's aristocracies. But to the best of our knowledge, Shaka did not have any children, male or female, at least none that he acknowledged. It has variously been supposed as a result that he was either sterile or perhaps homosexual, but this might not have been the case at all. It was a common practice amongst Shaka's successors to not publicly declare their children, the better to prevent any succession crises arising amongst a wide brood of children. Given that in the 1820s, Shaka was still a healthy man in his 30s, he might well have been reluctant to declare who his children were, in order to avoid rivalries developing amongst them and political factions emerging. If this was the case, it proved counterproductive to his lineage, as Shaka was struck down relatively early in his life. Although the absence of a recognized male heir for Shaka could potentially be justified in this manner, the subsequent setbacks that plagued the Zulu Kingdom in the mid-1820s may necessitate additional clarification. Shaka's rise to power and early reign are most remarkable for the seemingly meteoric success he experienced. Not only did he triumph over formidable odds to return to his homeland and establish himself as the head of the Zulus, but he did so despite the oppositional claims of his numerous half-brothers. Impondo members were the initial of these antagonistic communities. In April 1824, Mdlaka Kansidi, one of Shaka's most accomplished military commanders, led a substantial Zulu army southwards along the foothills of the Drakensberg Mountains and east through the valley of the river Mzimvubu into the Impondo lands. Mdlaka commanded perhaps 3,000 to 5,000 Zulu warriors. Our records are not clear on this count. However, This was largely a cattle raid, and he attempted to abscond with a large proportion of King Faku of the Impondo's herd, but Faku's impis quickly responded and won out over Mdlaka's raiding party, before harrying them with guerrilla-style strikes, all the way along. As they proceeded north back to the kingdom of the Zulus, eventually Mdlaka abandoned the captured cattle, and his warriors were so short of rations during their retreat, that they had to rely on their stores of watermelon for water. The campaign, the first major defeat of a Zulu horde during Shaka's reign, became known as the Amabisi Impi, roughly meaning the melon campaign, and this incident lived long in the memory of the Zulus. This, in conjunction with a number of subsequent military and political setbacks, prompted Shaka to exhibit progressively vindictive and violent tendencies from 1824 to 1826. An instance illustrating this was an assault under his command against the Quabe tribe. The Quabe, one of the initial smaller tribes bordering Zululand that Shaka conquered in the early 1820s, was now the target of a major army sent by him in response to a series of political assassinations within his realm. This army was not intended for conquest, nor did it have any explicit military or political objectives. Rather, its purpose was annihilation. Shaka's impis dispersed throughout the countryside, killing the Quabe wherever they encountered them. The extent of the violence reportedly witnessed was so extreme that Shaka's mother Nandi, a formidable individual who had never before disciplined her son, was deeply appalled by his behavior on this particular occasion. Shaka relocated the Zulu capital to their conquered territories in the wake of the Quabe campaign. At the time, accounts from individuals such as Isaacs and Finn, who were present during this period in 1827 and 1828, provide a particularly detailed description of the Zulu court that was established here and the development of the kingdom Shaka had constructed over the previous decade. Shaka established his new capital in close proximity to the river Vlithus, on a hill ridge situated around 27 kilometers north of the present-day settlement of Esho. The appellation, Kwa Bulawayo, which translates to place of death, perhaps encapsulates the ethos of Shaka's entire reign. The Zulu royal capital that he had constructed here would have been a more sizable municipality than the majority of settlements in the Zulu Kingdom, the vast majority of which functioned as villages. Situated in the heart of the capital city of Kwa Bulawayo, the Isogodlo served as a quasi-royal palace exclusive to Shaka and his harem of wives and concubines. It was fortified with stringent security measures, and restricted access was nearly unattainable. Individuals attempting to enter without a royal summons from Shaka faced capital punishment. However, beyond its function as a Zulu harem, the Isogodlo also functioned as a hub for government, housing Shaka's closest advisors and government ministers. Despite the rudimentary state of affairs and technological advancements in Kwa Bulawayo during 1826 and 1827, the prevailing systems that had governed sovereign courts in Europe during the Middle Ages were still operational at that time. Insofar as this was a hierarchical society, court life was extremely ceremonial. In the mornings, when Shaka ascended, a gatekeeper of the Isogodlo would sound a bell to inform the greater community of Bulawayo that the Zulu king had ascended. Subsequently, events were characterized by formal procedures throughout the day. In the evenings, banquets were organized, featuring seating and dining hierarchies. Guests were escorted into the royal presence for formal greetings and beverages. Therefore, the aforementioned describes the character of the Zulu court that dominated the kingdom established by Shaka in the decade following his initial conquest of power in 1816. However, from a psychological standpoint, it would have progressively become an unsettling place to reside, particularly considering Shaka's escalating tyranny in his final years. His brutality had long been a source of ire. For example, one infamous anecdote pertains to the Zulu warlord's practice of confining individuals. As a final admonition to all, the hut or kraal containing the remnants of the party that had provoked Shaka would be incinerated, serving as a warning to all not to challenge the authority of the king of the Zulus. However, during his final year of life, Shaka's increasingly erratic behavior was precipitated by the October 1827 death of his mother, Nandi. Undoubtedly, their remarkably strong connection stemmed from Shaka's upbringing, during which time Nandi was expelled and Shaka was disavowed by his father Senzingakona. Shaka was reportedly driven to a state of insanity in the days and weeks that followed the death of his mother. His subjects were ordered to observe a prolonged period of mourning for the king's mother, and those deemed to be exhibiting an inadequate degree of sorrow were subject to punishment, which occasionally included execution. However, subsequent chroniclers indicate that the primary concern was that Shaka ordered the suspension of essential tasks such as the sowing of crops. The aforementioned assertions regarding Shaka's activities during his final months of life may have been fabricated at a later date by those responsible for his demise in the autumn of 1828, 1 year following Nandi's demise. The scheme emerged from within Shaka's immediate family and was spearheaded by two of his half-brothers, Dlingana and Dingaan. Prior to this, in the autumn of 1828, these two had unsuccessfully attempted to assassinate Shaka. Although their treachery had gone undiscovered, they now had new allies, most notably Mkabayi, an aunt of Shaka's and sister to the late King Senzingakona. During the afternoon of September 22, 1828, the two individuals, accompanied by a cohort of conspirators, arrived at Kwanyakamubi, another royal residence of Shaka. Angered by their presence, Shaka issued an order for them to depart, citing the late hour of the day. However, several of them charged him, with Dingaan and Dlingana attempting to join in from behind the kraal's fence. As they fatally stabbed the king of the Zulus, he is believed to have shifted his attention to the however, alternative accounts suggest that he posed a more prophetic query: "Are you piercing me, earthly kings?" Regardless of which statement is accurate, we know what followed. The king of the Zulus, who had unified and expanded the kingdom for the previous decade, perished instantly at the location. He was only 41 years old. Dingaan, Shaka's half-brother and murderer, seized power of the Zulu Kingdom in the weeks and months following his assassination. His reign was motivated by paranoia, and he conducted a widespread purge of the extended royal family in order to secure his position and eliminate potential challenges. However, the greatest threat to his rule originated from beyond the borders of the Zulu Kingdom. In an effort to evade British occupation, Boer communities situated to the southwest commenced a migration towards the northeast and inland in 1836. Initially under the leadership of Piet Retief, these Boer trekkers, also known as Voortrekkers, initially formed an alliance with Dingaan's Zulus. However, subsequent to a rift and Andries Pretorius' ascent to power among them, the Zulus encountered an increasingly formidable foe in the form of the Voortrekkers. Following his significant military triumph over Dingaan in 1839, Pretorius directed the Zulu leader northward towards Swaziland. Subsequently, Dingaan's early purges spared his half-brother Impande, who formed an alliance with Pretorius. Following a brief military campaign, Dingaan was deposed and Impande was crowned king of the Zulus in 1840. Concurrently, Pretorius and his Voortrekkers founded the state of Natalia. Impande's reign was notably tranquil, as he formed an alliance with Queen Victoria's government following the British conquest of Natalia in 1842. This astute strategic move ensured the Zulu Kingdom's independence until the conclusion of his reign in 1872. Nonetheless, storm clouds were accumulating during this period, and the British presence on the southernmost point of Africa continued to grow throughout the 1850s, 1860s, and 1870s. During the 1850s and 1860s, a number of states arose in the area that is now South Africa. At the center of this was the British-controlled Cape Colony, where the Voortrekkers established Natalia, which was subsequently subsumed by the British state in an equally swift fashion. However, as the British became preoccupied with events transpiring elsewhere, most notably the Crimean War in Southeast Europe from 1853 to 1856, additional Boer states came into existence during the 1850s. However, the Zulus encountered a predicament as more and more resources, such as gemstones and gold, were discovered in the area. This enticed an increasing number of settlers, including the notorious advocate of British imperialism in Africa, Cecil Rhodes. With the expansion of settlement in the area, Cetshwayo, Mpande's son, encountered mounting pressure from the British in the southwestern part of the continent beginning in 1872. This culminated in the Anglo-Zulu War, which broke out in 1879 and is widely recognized as a significant event in the history of European imperialism in 19th-century Africa. The Anglo-Zulu War spanned a duration of 6 months, commencing in January 1879 and concluding in June of the same year. Western audiences have gained considerable awareness of this conflict through the notable films Zulu, starring Michael Caine, and Zulu Dawn, starring Burt Lancaster and Peter O'Toole, that were released in 1964 and 1979, respectively. However, these films have portrayed the conflict as if the Zulu had achieved a victory. Zulu Dawn was the first film to depict a small British garrison engaged in combat. The war ensued as a result of pressure exerted on King Cetshwayo in 1878 by Sir Bartle Frere, the British Empire's High Commissioner in the Cape Colony, with the intention of inciting conflict with the Zulu Kingdom. Frere orchestrated a boundary dispute with the Zulus in 1878, and subsequently issued an ultimatum to Cetshwayo in December. The ultimatum contained ludicrous demands, including the complete dissolution of the Zulu army and the deployment of the entire militia. These conditions would have essentially rendered Cetshwayo a vassal of the British government of the Cape Colony and were therefore unacceptable to him. Putting aside these reservations, he was also keen on preventing a war and made every effort to refrain from unequivocally rejecting Frere's ultimatum. However, his deliberations were in vain, as Frere's intention had been to incite a dispute, and his reluctance was rewarded in January 1879, when the British crossed the border with thousands of troops. The British, led by Lord Chelmsford, initiated their military campaign in Zululand on January 11, 1879. Originally, the plan called for the deployment of around 16,000 troops across 5 distinct contingents. However, only 10,000 were ultimately mobilized in 3 divisions. Cetshwayo, on the other hand, possessed approximately 35,000 warriors. However, they predominantly employed rudimentary implements, including spears, shields, and a few limited instances of firearms. The Zulus, despite their technological disadvantage, managed to repel the initial invasion of Zululand and secure the first blood. On January 22, an isolated column of 1,800 British and colonial troops encamped near the hill of Isandlwana in the northeastern region of present-day South Africa was besieged by a force of approximately 20,000 Zulu warriors. The British had failed to establish a defensive perimeter at Isandlwana due to their failure to underestimate the Zulus. Sheer numbers determined the outcome. The Zulus' superiority over the British was compensated for by their 11-to-1 numerical advantage, and they engaged in a bullhorn battle format. Amidst the concluding exchanges of gunfire, the British encountered ammunition depletion, precipitating a descent into intense hand-to-hand combat where the Zulus maintained a marginal military advantage. Ultimately, a mere few hundred of the 1,800 British and colonial forces managed to escape the Battle of Isandlwana. An estimated 1,300 lay dead and wounded across the battlefield. Precise figures regarding the number of Zulu casualties and wounded are unavailable. Nevertheless, approximations at the time put the number in the thousands. The British forces' most significant defeat to date, this time against an indigenous army that was inadequately armed, was only partially alleviated by the subsequent day's successful repulsion of an estimated 3,500 Zulus by 150 British soldiers at Rorke's Drift, a nearby mission station. The Battle of Rorke's Drift and the Battle of Isandlwana are the pivotal moments of the films Zulu Dawn and Zulu, respectively. The initial assault on Zululand was thwarted by the defeat at the Battle of Isandlwana. However, some detachments persisted in operations along the border with Zululand until the spring of 1879. In the early summer of that year, Lord Chelmsford, cognizant of the impending revocation of his command due to the failure at Isandlwana, spearheaded a subsequent invasion into Zululand. This incursion was considerably more successful, not least because significant advancements were achieved, reaching their apex with the Battle of Ulundi on July 4, 1879. At this location, approximately 4,000 British and colonial troops engaged in combat with more than 13,000 Zulu warriors in the capital of Cetshwayo's kingdom. A disciplined advance by ranks of British gunmen, aided by Gatling guns, rendered the Zulu battle tactics entirely futile, resulting in the Zulu warriors' eventual retreat from the area. Ultimately, only 10 British soldiers perished, whereas over 500 Zulu warriors were injured. The Anglo-Zulu War was effectively concluded with the victory at Ulundi, which also put an end to the Zulu nation's independence, which Shaka had established more than 50 years prior. Following the conclusion of the war, Cetshwayo was essentially reduced to the position of a puppet king. For a brief audience with Queen Victoria in England, he was dispatched. Cetshwayo passed away in 1884, and Zululand was annexed by the British in 1887, notwithstanding the son and heir Dinizulu's best efforts to preserve the Zulu Kingdom, in part by attempting alliances with the Boer states. It marked the onset of a phase characterized by the swift consolidation and enlargement of the British influence in South Africa, culminating in two conflicts with the Boers in 1880 and 1881, and more significantly, from 1899 to 1902. After the aforementioned conflict, referred to as the Second Boer War, the British emerged as the dominant force in the area, resembling the present-day state of South Africa. Consequently, Shaka's kingdom, established between 1816 and 1828, withstood British encroachments for a duration of 50 years. However, similar to the other Boer states, it ultimately succumbed to the British Dominion's progression in southern Africa. In what manner ought Shaka Zulu to be assessed with respect to the kingdom he established and the destiny that transpired following his demise? There is perhaps a tendency to view Shaka today as a romantic figure, one who bravely tried to build up a centralized Zulu kingdom, which could withstand the impending onslaught of the European aggressors, but this is to give Shaka far too much credit. There is no denying the brutality of European imperialism in Africa during the 19th century, but this was really only starting at the time of Shaka's rise to power. During the first half of the 19th century, when Shaka reigned, the European presence in sub-Saharan Africa was largely confined to some limited coastal regions like the Cape Colony, the Gold Coast, as well as the port towns along the west coast. It was not until the 1860s and the 1870s that the real scramble for Africa began. As such, while the Zulus and Shaka would have been conscious of the European presence, in the form of the British and the Boers to the southwest, and were also increasingly in direct contact with them as traders, they would not have perceived him as an existential threat to their way of life, in the 1810s and 1820s. Based on the available evidence, Shaka could be characterized as a power seeker who established the Zulu Kingdom for his own benefit rather than as a means of resisting the white man. Throughout his career, he fought against nearly all of his fellow Bantu people. Although his military prowess is undeniable, and his centralization of the Zulu state to enhance its efficacy was commendable at the time, it is undeniable that his primary objective was personal gain. He then, like so many other autocrats throughout history, resorted to delusional behavior and violence after attaining that power. The individual in question established the Zulu Kingdom, but it is indisputable that the kingdom suffered one of the most significant military setbacks British forces in Africa endured in the 19th century. This fact leaves the most lasting impact on public perception regarding the Zulu Kingdom, which Shaka initially established as a power in southern Africa. What is your assessment of Shaka Zulu? Did he ascend to power as a vicious warlord by subduing his fellow Bantu people? Or did he emerge as an African hero who founded a kingdom that withstood European encroachments for decades following his demise? Kindly provide your feedback in the remarks section. Until then, we appreciate your attention.